Good morning, everyone. The title of this morning's talk is The Neurobiology of Human Connection, using neuroscience to understand relationships. And I thank you for being here this morning, because my experience is that people, when they hear the words neuroscience or neurobiology, they often have one or two reactions. One is they think, well, that's going to be super boring. And the other one is that they're going to think, well, I don't know much about the brain. This is probably going to be quite complicated, and I guess by extension, super boring. And you know, it is true that neuroscience can be both very complicated and very boring. And some of the scientific papers in this field will really try your resolve. But my goal today is really to engage both your heart and your mind, to translate the findings from neuroscience into something meaningful that we can all use in our lives. This talk is about human connection, because relationships really go to the very heart of what it means to be human. Other people shape who we are and who we become. And I don't mean that as a beautiful metaphor, I mean that in a literal way. And I don't mean it just when we're children, in our childhood, but throughout our lives. In African Bantu, Ubuntu means that you only become a person through others. So we look to other people to see who we are. Neuroscience have not been able to find a place in the brain where the self sits. So it seems like the sense of who we are, the self, is an emerging process in our interaction with our environment, perhaps probably most importantly our social environment. But what I hope you get out of this talk today is to gain a deeper understanding of who we really are. And perhaps also to get the courage to allow yourself to be more human with others. So to be more vulnerable, be more open, be more kind, and be more present with other people. The main point that neuroscience and evolutionary biology tells us is that we all want the same thing. We want to connect, because it is deeply and innately wired into us to connect with other human beings. My main interest as a teacher, a supervisor, and a clinician are human relationships, and not just what happens psychologically, but what happens neurobiologically and physiologically when we connect and when we disconnect with other people. And I have to say, it's a really good time to be interested in these kind of things, because hardly a week goes by without some new interesting research coming out in what we can call the field of interpersonal neurobiology. It used to be that if we were interested in looking at the brain, we would have to ask your consent and then wait for you to die. And then we would open your skull and we would slice up your brain, and we would say, okay, so this is what the brain looks like of somebody who loved gardening, who had 3 children, and who was a kind person. Versus this brain over here, that was of a person who loved gardening, had 3 children, but killed his neighbor. Now, because of incredible advancement in technology, we can now look at a living brain. So now we don't need to worry about you dying, but we do have to worry about you having a panic attack. Because what we do is we lower you into what is basically a metal coffin, actually a noisy metal coffin, and while you're in there, we're asking you to look at certain things or think about certain things while we're looking at what's happening in your brain. But it has been said, because of our social nature, and we must remember as human beings, we are the most social of all social creatures on the planet. So because of our social nature, it's been suggested that to really understand who we are, we need to have what can be called a two-person neuroscience, really to be looking at what's happening when people are connecting and disconnecting. Because a lot of things in the human brain really only comes online when we are resonating with another brain. So recently, things have come out from Princeton University, where they have developed brain scanners that are small enough that we can fit them to people, onto people, and see what happens when they are connecting and when they're disconnecting. And the results are referred to as brain-to-brain coupling. What they show is that when we're connecting with someone, when we are attuned, when we resonate with someone, our brains light up in the same area at the same time. Basically, I can make your brain look like mine. And if that scares you, think about this for a moment. Everything that happens in the interpersonal space between us is bidirectional. So as I'm making my brain look like yours, you are also making my brain look like yours. We're looking, it's bidirectional. Now, to understand who we are, we need to go back in time and see where we have come from. And that's what evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology is interested in. It's the bigger view of the development of the species, if you like. At the panel session later today, we'll be looking at the development of the individual and what happens when we encounter difficulties. But right now, our perspective is a bigger one where we're looking at the development of the species. Evolutionary biology looks at what forces has shaped our physiology and our neurobiology. And I think that this is important for us to know, because the more we understand ourselves, the more we can work with our strength and negotiate our weaknesses. So consider for a moment the polar bear. The polar bear lives in the Arctic, and it is exquisitely adapted to these conditions. So it has a thick fur that protects it from the cold. It is white, so it is camouflage. And it is a powerful swimmer, so it can catch prey. When we exhibit the polar bear in a zoo, we try to imitate its natural habitat. So we try to make the enclosure something like out of the Arctic Circle rather than, say, a subtropical forest. But what about us? What is our natural habitat? Is it rural or urban? Is it coastal or inland? Is it very wet climate or very dry climate? Is it very hot climate or very cold climate? Because the truth is, when you look at human beings, we can live pretty much anywhere there's oxygen. But we cannot live alone. So for humans, other people are our natural habitat. If we were to be exhibited in a zoo, there would have to be a warning to our keeper: do not house in isolation. Because isolation, as we shall see in a little bit, has a profound impact on not just our mental health and well-being, but our physical health as well. Now, the need to belong is seen across cultures and times in human evolution. Historically, our survival has depended on others to be able to share resources, to be able to build shelters, to protect one another, and to get through this burdensome thing called parenting. So, and our brains have adapted accordingly. A lot of the brain real estate, if you like, or a lot of the area in the brain is devoted to sending, receiving, and processing information that has to do with other people. Now, if we look across species, what we see is the more social the animal, the bigger the brain. What that suggests is that our big brains have not developed so that we can make tools and invent things, but rather to decipher social information. Because our social environment, meaning other people, it's much more unpredictable, it's much more complex, and it's much more shaped by our own behavior than our physical environment. For example, if one of you come up to me after this talk and you smile with one side of your face, which I think is referred to as a smirk, you look at me and you go, great talk, Sophia. That's quite different to if you come up and you look at me and you smile with both sides of your face and you say, hey, great talk, Sophia. Now, the verbal content of those two sentences are the same, but they mean the exact opposite. The first one means we don't like you, you're not part of this tribe, and we're not going to share our resources with you, and we're not going to protect you. Whereas the second one means we like you, you're part of our in-group, we will share our resources with you and keep you safe. And my brain very quickly has to work out which one is which. Remember, our survival has always depended on other people. Neuroscience tells us that we need one core ingredient to be able to connect, and that's a sense of safety. We have 4 responses available to us when we interact with the world: fight, flight, freeze, and social connection. Fight, flight, or freeze are defensive reactions, and the last one allows us to connect with others. Now, our nervous system determines whether we will be prickly and aggressive, as in fight, whether we will avoid people or situations, as in flight, whether we will have a behavioral and a mental shutdown, as in freeze, or whether we will be able to connect with other people. Think of your nervous system as your fierce protector. Its job is to keep you alive. It's your own personal surveillance system that is constantly scanning the environment for cues of safety and cues of danger. And here is where it becomes really important for us. Our nervous system will not allow us to connect unless we feel safe. It is not a conscious choice, but it is physiologically impossible for humans, for mammals actually in general, but let's just stay with humans. It is physiologically impossible for us to connect with others when we don't feel safe. At work, with friends, and in our intimate relationships, we are only able to connect, and our brain only allows us access to higher order processing areas when it determines that we are safe. But importantly, for human beings, because of our social nature, safety is not just physical safety. It's not just that you're not going to just walk up to me and hit me. It is also psychological safety. So you won't shame me, embarrass me, ostracize me, make fun of me, make me feel not important. Now, I suggest that in our interactions with others, we ask 2 core questions. Now, these 2 questions are often unspoken, but they are core to our connection nonetheless. We ask, am I safe with you? Do I matter to you? Later today, we will talk about trauma, and we will see how both of these questions are violated with different interpersonal traumatic experiences, particularly in childhood, but also later on. But we ask, am I safe? Meaning, of course, that you won't hit me, but also that you won't reject me, you won't shame me, you won't ostracize me, you won't bully me, you won't make me feel not good enough. Do I matter to you? Will you listen to me? Will you acknowledge me? Will you give me your attention? Will you make me a priority, and will you make me feel cared for and supported? Now, other people have an impact on us psychologically, neurobiologically, and physiologically. So psychologically, you can make me feel happy, you can make me feel sad, excited, or fearful. Neurobiologically, you can impact the activation of my brain in a more momentary way, like we saw with the brain-to-brain coupling. But you can also impact the structure and the chemical activation long-term in my brain by something the scientists call long-term potentiation. Physically, you can rev me up, or you can settle down my stress response and subsequent levels of stress hormone cortisol, and inflammation of my body, and my immune functioning. Really, the reason why I get excited about neuroscience is because it tells us what I think we have intuitively known all along, which is other people change us. The psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, he said the meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. So we need connections, and we need a sense of belonging. But what happens when that core need fails? If we look at the research from loneliness, what we see is that loneliness has an impact on our health compatible to high blood pressure, lack of exercise, obesity, and smoking. Basically, it's been said that a feeling of loneliness is as bad for your physical health as smoking 2 packets of cigarettes a day. That is because loneliness activates our defensive responses of fight, flight, and freeze. Because our survival throughout history has not just depended on not being eaten by a predator or killed by an enemy, but our survival has also depended on being connected with the group. Being cast out of the group was dangerous and often meant death for the individual. So our brains treat isolation like any other threat and drops into defense and releases cortisol, which has wear and tear not just on the body but on the brain as well. Cortisol, which is the main stress hormone in the body, is a neurotoxin, meaning that if we have high levels of cortisol coursing around the body for a long time, there are particular structures in the brain that are very sensitive to that. Particularly a structure called the hippocampus, which is very important for not just learning and memory, but also the hippocampus is the main powerhouse for making new neurons in the brain, something called neurogenesis, and also producing something we can think of as a fertilizer of the brain-derived neurotrophin factor, or BDNF. Now, it has been found in people with severe PTSD that they have a 40% shrinkage of their hippocampi. And that is something we really need to take into consideration. It has an impact on our brain. So, we have a problem. Because when we look at the recent Australian data, this is what we see. 1 in 5 rarely have anybody to talk to. 1 in 5. 30% rarely or never feel part of a group, and 22% feel they don't have other people to turn to. These numbers floored me. But it is not just a mental health problem. This is what it's so important for us to understand. This is not just a mental health problem, it is a biomedical problem, because as we looked at before, it has physiological and neurobiological consequences as well. It's a national health disaster we are facing, and as clinicians, we are seeing the consequences of this every day in our lives. And unfortunately, this is a global phenomenon amongst Western modern countries. In the US, we have 40% of people reporting that they're feeling lonely. These are millions and millions of people in defensive reactions all the time. It is especially ironic, perhaps, when we think, where is this taking place? It's taking place in modern Western societies where we have, most of us, not all of us, but most of us have got places to live. We got food to eat, we got access to clean water and education, and there's a lack of civil war and unrest, yet something has gone very, very wrong in the way that we set up our society when we have millions and millions of people that are walking around in fight, flight, or freeze most of the time. So, as I mentioned, I'm from Denmark originally. And weirdly, the Danes come out consistently as some of the happiest people on the planet by research commissioned by the United Nations. And you would ask why, because it's definitely not because of the weather. I was back last month in May, height of spring, and there were sunny days, but basically it was cold and rainy, as it is most of the year. So think of the Danish climate sort of as the opposite of a tropical paradise. That's the kind of weather you're looking at. Yet the Danes are happy. So the researchers are suggesting that the reasons why the Danes come out as some of the happiest people is they have a feeling of belonging. They belong to clubs and groups and organizations and societies, and they catch up on an informal and a formal basis regularly. They feel connected. Now, our language reflects our world, and it reflects what's important to us. So, for example, in Finland, and I say this not because I speak Finnish, but because I've read it and I thought it was interesting. In Finland, they have one word for a flock of reindeer. So you think, why would that be important? Why does it matter whether there's 2 reindeers or a flock of reindeers? It kind of does, because if you spook a reindeer and it runs off 1 or 2, you can probably dodge. A flock is a stampede, you might be in danger. So in Finnish, it makes sense to have one word for a flock of reindeer. Now in Denmark, they have the word hygge. Hygge is hard to translate, which is why the Danish word is being culturally exported. And it has recently become quite famous. So hygge is about coziness, warmth, togetherness, security, and safety. Hygge is about the experience rather than about things. Hygge, it has to be said, can be done on your own. So think about sitting in a comfortable chair, you have a cup of chai next to you, you have a good book, the cat is purring in your lap and the sun is coming through the windows, you've got Mozart on the stereo. Now, that would be considered hygge. But most of the time, hygge is associated with being with others. The Hygge Manifesto. So what you can see, hygge is about being safe, that we can let our guard down, that we can exhale, a feeling that we matter, that we're equal, there's a sense of community, being authentic and belonging. It's sort of the opposite of showing off, of needing the ego to be reinforced, of defending ourselves or attacking other people. It's not about being in competition or being the center of attention. It's a sense that we can make each other feel safe physiologically and psychologically. And for the Danes, at least, hygge is not just something that we do with our friends and our family, but it's actually something that is brought into the workplace as well. So hygge really is about the things that our nervous system needs in order to inhibit our defensive responses and allow us to connect. Remember what I said before, if our nervous system thinks that we might be in danger of being unsafe, it will not allow us to connect. So hopefully what this talk has made clear is how crucial relationship is to our well-being, not just psychologically, but physiologically as well. We may survive in this day and age without close connections to others, but we won't thrive because we are wired to connect. In our culture, we value autonomy, individualism, and independence. But as you've seen from what I talked about today, that goes against our biology. How often do you think we'll win the fight against our biological wiring? Yeah, that's right, never. That's 0%. So as the Borg say, As the Borg say in Star Trek, resistance is futile. And I think we might as well surrender to who we are, to our biological wiring, and thereby allow ourselves richer, easier and more fulfilling lives. I'll leave you with this quote from the poet and writer Maya Angelou, who says, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Or, as the orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Canal, said when we talk about patient care, he said, "The patient will never care how much you know until they know how much you care." Thank you.